The answer is going to be twofold. Right now I have a more coaching role in more schools, but when I was an occupational therapist at an elementary and a middle school, I personally implemented it quite a bit before our district took it on in a broader sense. At the elementary school level, one of the most fun things I was able to do is go into all of the second grade classrooms on a tier 1 general education level. It started because I had a student on my caseload who needed more help and hated being pulled out and hated push-in. So this was our way that I could reach him in a way that it didn't feel threatening to him. And then the other teachers were interested also. So I ended up going into all 3 classes on a weekly basis and running interoception lessons. So that was really fun. I also did a lot of working to try to modify as much as I could for students with cognitive disabilities, because I brought it into 2 of our autism programs, which are self-contained programs that do have an element of, involvement in gen ed. However, they spend a lot of their time in a self-contained environment. And one of the typical pieces that gets you placed in that program is intellectual disabilities, complex communication, pieces like that. So we did quite a bit of, well, maybe it's a week, but maybe it's not a week. Maybe it's a month on hand. And maybe we're using more symbols, and maybe we're using some symbols from their AEC in order to make that kind of connection, and talking about likes and dislikes and, comfortable and uncomfortable in more than just physical. So, so they can, because do they understand the concept of, this feels comfortable or this doesn't, when they've kind of never been asked that. So, we really were doing it quite differently in those programs. I also used it in some small group and individual sessions. So it was pretty varied. And I was very lucky that I had a level 2 student as well, a fieldwork student, and she was really passionate. And I've since found out that she's using it in the clinic that she's working in, which is really exciting. But she did it as her project. So she took a lot of the symbols that we were using and she created these huge posters and like Velcro symbols, so that when kids came into their classroom or when kids came into the OT room, they could pull off and they could tell us how they were feeling. It's almost like a check-in and a check-out for their OT sessions or their classroom setting. I saw it the most with my gen ed population, but that might be because they have an easier time expressing, some of what they're thinking and feeling than some of my more complex communicators who might be feeling all those things but had more trouble expressing it. I would get stopped in the hallway with stories. Like, I was at a basketball game and my sister got the winning basket and I knew I was excited because my lungs were going fast. So that was super fun. We did a lot in those classes of personal experience. So I would come in and say, share a time in the last week where you were conscious of your blah and what did that look like? So I think that was super helpful, because then it was less about, the worksheet I filled out and much more about the personal experience. I also pushed them to not talk about pain as often. I would always let the first few be about pain, but otherwise every single comment was, I stubbed my toe, I got a paper cut, I banged my elbow. And I was really trying to get them to broaden, because that is one of the few things I think a lot of people are aware of, especially in the neurotypical population. And I really wanted them to expand beyond that into how that fit with emotions. And so it was cool to get that feedback that people were thinking about it, they were processing it, they were talking about at times whether or not their parents were aware of their own bodies, and if they were utilizing it. I would have a kid come to me and say, I really have trouble with sleep, I don't know how to do that, and it came out in these conversations. I would say when I was adapting it for the autism classrooms, I had a harder time knowing if it was having an effect. I felt good introducing it. I felt like it was giving the adults in the environment the impression that it's not just about compliance, it's about what their bodies are telling them. I would like to think that that exposure was really important, because I believe in presumed competence, and just because someone's not expressing doesn't mean it's not having an impact. I did have a few really beautiful moments, like a kid who came into my room and she is a complex communicator. And, she took the full sign and put it on bladder and told us she had to pee. So there were times where we had those. It was just, I think I needed to develop. It would have been sort of my next step if I had stayed in that role. I needed to develop a better way of, knowing how much they were taking in and, that functional effect. Carryover, right, is always my hardest part. I think that was the hardest part as an OT period. And honestly, as my current role also, I think that's one of the hardest parts, right? When you have your own classroom, you have a lot of control. If you're a principal in a building, you have a lot of control of affecting change. When your role is more of a collaborative coaching role, right, which even as an OT, I think my role was a collaborative coaching person. Yeah, I got my half an hour of service, but like, what's that going to do for a kid if there's no carryover? I think you really have to make yourself marketable. Like you have to convince people of why what you're bringing to the table is going to make their life better, make their life, easier, more productive, et cetera, or you don't get that buy-in. It's a work in progress. I think our district is better than some in that it's not all compliance all day, all the time. Like I find our school psychs are fantastic at this. Some of our admin fantastically well. So a lot of it is just that consistency and trying to just plant those seeds like, I wonder if it really was their fault they did that. And just like leaving it and trying not to beat a dead horse kind of thing. But that part's really hard. So my hope is talking over and over again about the fact that it's not not won't, but can't. They don't have that skill yet is helpful. I think really, if a teacher is not running the lesson, but hearing that we're talking about, body autonomy and understanding things better is great. I think one of the things I would have, again, done differently on year 2 was explain to the teachers that if you want me to do this, it's not me taking over your class, it's a co-teaching opportunity with a little bit more of an accountability system of like, how is this going to be carried over in between? One of those teachers especially would tell me a lot of stories in between, which was great. But I would have loved to make that. I think I was just treading lightly because it was the first time an OT was ever going to do anything like this. But I think that would have been a cool part 2 to it if I had continued in that same role. Just try it. I think one of the big things that was helpful is that it's very explicit and easy. I would tell people to almost start with a few small pieces of it that are the easiest and then go from there. The things I did the most, honestly, I had the charts where you could put in the adjectives, and I did it with pictures more with my complex communicators and with words more with my, general education neurotypical peers. I generally started with that. I started with the cards and I started with some hands-on experiments. The only piece that I added on beyond that was crucial was the body check once they got a little bit more fluent. Other than that, if I didn't use any, I did end up using some other pieces, but if I hadn't, I would have felt perfectly comfortable with that. It has to be fun. And we have to be open to like the unexpected. So even if you prepared for 10 hours to give we have a comic about inclusion, but it could be about anything. And you have 2 people and one person is like sitting buried by books and the other person is like in the front of the classroom. And, one is saying, yep, we'll start this work in 8 years from now when I've gone through all the research. And then we have the other one that's like, we're just going to start. So I think about that pretty often. Like you don't want to start blindly and you don't want to, not be thorough about things. But this is one of those where it's not like giving a bot where you like really can mess up how you're doing it. Like, so let's say you did this experiment and not that experiment, and the kid said they felt something that you weren't expecting them to feel. That's not a wrong answer. So it gives a lot more flexibility. If these issues are coming from the amygdala, if these issues are coming from, diencephalon, like lower brainstem, whatever, like how can we do everything at the cortical level? It doesn't make any sense, right? And yes, there are ways to actually solve some of the struggles, and that's awesome. And kids need to be in, OT and working on those things. And sometimes medication is necessary and nothing wrong with that. But in the meantime, if all of our education only comes from a higher cognitive level when we're talking about body stuff, we're going to miss the boat.